Next up, we have the CEO of Brown Girl Mag, and that's Trisha Sakhuja-Walia, and she's going to give us the rundown with Seema Nanda, the CEO of the Democratic National Committee, the former CEO, and Dr. Karthick Ramakrishnan, who's a principal at CRW Strategy. I think Trisha is here. She's joining us on the move. But it seems like your signal is good. So welcome. Thanks for hosting.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Neil. I'm so excited to be here with Dr. Ramakrishnan and Seema. Sorry that I am on the move, but thankfully we can all tune in virtually. So without further ado, I'd love to dive in and unpack a little bit on the Indian American electorate. With you, Dr. Karthick Ramakrishnan. You've been so active this year with polling in our community, and I'm genuinely so intrigued to learn a little bit more about your findings. So I'd love for you to share. And while you do, can you tell us a little bit about what's your sense of how the South Asian American electorate is leaning this year? And my follow-up to that is, are you worried not enough of our parents and grandparents will be voting?
Thank you for having me, Trisha, and happy as always to be here. And I think this is where more than a decade of survey research is finally paying off. People are paying attention to our communities. I think even without Kamala Harris, there was already a fair amount of interest in this fast-growing community, but certainly her pick has heightened interest and awareness. I think people have long known that South Asian populations have been the most Democratic leaning among all Asian American groups. One way to think about South Asian voters is that their support for Democratic presidential candidates has been slightly above what it's been for Latino voters and below what it's been for African Americans. What we saw in our Asian American voter survey, we only have data on Indian Americans this year. It's really difficult and expensive to poll on other South Asian populations. And what we found is that consistent with past efforts, you're seeing about a 2/3 to 1/3 split for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. You have about 6% undecided. If you allocate them at the same level, you're probably looking at a 70-30 split among Indian American voters. There is a gender split that is emerging this year, though, that we have not seen in the past. So among men, you still see support for Biden over Trump. It's a 55-40 split. But among women, you're seeing a 75-16 split. In past years, we have not seen that strong of a gender split. Some may say maybe this is because of Kamala Harris, but our survey was in the field before and after the announcement, and this gender split existed even prior to that. We're also seeing a split in terms of native born, so those born in the U.S. as opposed to naturalized citizens. So the native born split is 79-16 for Biden over Trump. For the naturalized citizen set, it's 60-32. And then finally, when it comes to age group, you see the strongest support among the youngest population, so 18-34. It's among the middle-aged population, 35-49, where it's a bit more competitive. 56-43 is the split that you see. And then among 50 plus, it actually goes back to something like a 72-28. So there's something really interesting going on in that 35-49-year-old naturalized citizen and male set where Donald Trump seems to have made headway since 2016. I'm happy to talk more later about why some of that might be the case.
Wow, that's like super interesting. I wish I could take notes right now. And so overall, where you leave, if you had to say.
I mean, overall, we're on track to seeing Indian Americans being among the strongest supporters among Asian Americans for Biden over Trump. I should note that, the kind of Democratic bias, if you will, that's pretty strong in the Indian American population. You see this in terms of campaign contributions. You see this in terms of people running for Congress and for other elected office. Generally speaking, much more likely to support Democrats than Republicans, and there are reasons for that. We've seen this as essentially a post 9/11 phenomenon. After 9/11, you saw a significant increase in nativism and ethnic nationalism and Christian conservatism within the Republican Party that turned off a lot of potential Indian Americans that might potentially support the Republican Party. They just found it a huge turnoff, to say the least. So the Republican Party has alienated a lot of Indian American voters. I hear a lot of people say, well, what about Nikki Haley? What about Bobby Jindal? What about Ajit Pai? Of course, these are important and prominent examples, Seema Verma and others, right, of folks that are Indian American and Republican, but they are the exception and not at all the rule. What we've seen in terms of elected office, in terms of candidates running, in terms of campaign contributions, in terms of where they stand on the issues. Indian Americans tend to be progressive on a range of issues, from gun control, environmental protection, immigrant rights. Final thing I'll point out, in terms of support for Black Lives Matter and racial justice, Indian Americans among Asian American groups have the strongest support on all of those dimensions.
Definitely. I'm grateful to see that support, and I'm grateful to see that progressiveness through the Brown Girl Magazine community. So I can definitely attest to a lot of what you're saying. And so, Seema, I'd like to ask, in your opinion, has the Democratic Party made particular efforts to appeal to South Asians even before Kamala's ticket? And when South Asians do vote for Joe Biden this year, what are some issues that you think we can expect to press on when and if he's elected?
Well, it is great to be with you, Trisha and Karthick. Karthick's, your data is just phenomenal for our entire community. The Democratic Party has been investing in South Asian voters since the 16 election, before the 16 election, but I think we've really seen a ramp up. I mean, the party knows that we lost the 2016 election by less than 100,000 votes. If you just look at those 3 Midwestern states, and every vote counts, particularly when you're talking about the Indian American population, one of the fastest growing populations, the fastest naturalizing populations. So just to give you one very recent example, I think it was in the last week, the party just announced a seven-figure investment in ad buys targeting the API community. So just to give you some context, in 2016, that investment was in the nature of $50,000. So this is historic, and this includes digital, print, TV, radio, so really everything. Another thing that we did at the party when I was there is we did a lot of early investing in ethnicity data, because it's not good enough just to know someone's Asian American, but really trying to understand what is the ethnic breakdown of certain Asian American communities. And that early investment has been able to facilitate a lot of very targeted phone banking that's taking place. So the party right now is working with a lot of these fantastic groups that are on the ground, that have been doing the work since 2016. These are groups like Samosa in Michigan and They See Blue in California. And then last, I think what you see the party doing is really high profile events. I mean, it's not just Kamala Harris as the surrogate, Senator Harris. Right. You see Joe Biden participating in these events. He was at a very prominent event on Indian Independence Day. There was a very big event in June that AAPI Vote put together. So you see really high profile surrogates, many of who are participating in your conference today. And then, Trisha, you also asked about what are the issues I think we can expect the South Asian community to really be pushing for in a next administration if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are elected as our president and vice president. I mean, I think through the research that Karthick has done is we see that South Asian voters care about what we all care about as Americans. They care about education. They care about healthcare and the economy. They care about guns and getting guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. But South Asians also care about racism and discrimination. And one really fantastic thing that I think Senator Harris's nomination has really brought forward is the commitment of the Indian American community two issues of racism and cross-cutting issues of how this is affecting the African-American community. And certainly immigration is a huge issue for the South Asian community, particularly issues around green cards and making sure we have some reform. Biden has talked about doing reform first and then removal of the country caps that has these very absurdly long waiting periods for green card holders. So those are some of the things I think our community would push for in a Biden administration.
Absolutely. We actually recently did an internal survey as well within our community to see what are some of their most biggest points that they'd like to press. And you've honestly, pointed out to all of them. So again, I can attest that our community is on that same page. So I want to dive in just a little bit deeper on identity. I genuinely do believe in keeping identity and policy separate, but I think in this case, the lines are being a little blurred this year. Lots of folks within the brown girl community are perhaps saying that Kamala Harris is only now, attaching herself to her South Asian identity. I'd love to hear, Seema or Dr. Ramakrishnan, your thoughts on that. How much does her half South Asian identity matter in this year's election? And does it give it a significant boost for the South Asian electorate?
All right, I'll go first because I appear on camera. So I'm going to push back a little on that, Trisha, and I totally hear you. I've heard that criticism as well, but I think if you look at Senator Harris's history, she has always talked about her identity. And I think one thing that we saw with her nomination is just an incredible amount of pride and excitement about her. I heard from so many people that they didn't expect to feel this emotional because we know she was a candidate for president and people thought this could happen. But I think for so many of us of a generation who grew up and, you'd see another Indian person at the grocery store and your parents would go, look, and this moment of feeling like, this is our time. And while Karthick has pointed out, we've had, the Nikki Haley's and the Bobby Jindals, but to see someone who so meets the moment of this time and the fact that she has this incredibly rich identity that really embodies who we all are as immigrants, as Indian Americans, but that she also is African American and has an immigrant background from that side of her background as well. I think it truly meets the moment. But I think identity is always an incredibly complex thing. And I think the way she talks about it is actually quite rich right now in all that she's bringing together. And I think it is really resonating with our community. But I'm very interested in Karthick's thoughts because I know his survey was out before and after.
Absolutely. What we found was the sample sizes weren't that large, but we found a bump up in terms of support for Biden among both Indian American men and women after the nomination. So again, I don't want to read too much into it because the sample sizes weren't large enough, but we saw a jump. One thing I'll say on this is that I think the important question is not just does she claim us, but do we claim her?
Sure.
And I think to echo what was just said, that we see an outpouring of support. And this, by the way, this is not something just after the VP nomination. Having been a California resident for nearly 2 decades now, and having been in San Francisco when she first ran for DA, she has been more of a party insider, and she wasn't as much of an open book. So it's not like she was talking about her identity much at all in her rise up the ranks. So I think once her book came out, she was much more comfortable talking about it. I think she's comfortable in her own skin, in contrast to folks like Bobby Jindal, right? I wrote a piece for CNN when you had Nikki Haley speak at the RNC. In terms of where Indian Americans are, in terms of their values, in terms of their positions, they're much closer to Harris than they are to Haley. So if there were ever a hypothetical matchup in the future between Haley and Harris, it's not even going to be close because people don't just vote based on their identities, but also on their values and their policy positions. So I think that's just important to to keep in mind that it's when you talk about identity, it's not just about there's this expression, skin folk ain't necessarily kin folk, right? So it's important to look at what the values are. I would say just personally, I'm actually no party preference, and I've done that because I've been running these surveys for a long time. But when she talked about her chittis during the nominations, it wasn't just that she's claiming her South Asian identity or an Indian identity. It's a very specific Tamil experience and identity. And to me, personally, that was very revealing to me, because that's a kind of authentic connection. She wasn't just generically talking about an Indian American experience. It was a very, very specific experience that was meaningful to her. And I think a lot of people saw that and were excited by it, even if they're not Tamilian, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, that moment was it was beyond. It was absolutely heartwarming. And, we've talked about her complex identity so much via Brown Girl, and so much of what you're saying makes perfect sense, because you're right. We need to claim her, but she also needs to claim the South Asian identity as well. So there's a little bit of a bridge there that we have to gap. But we recently shared a post of hers just a day ago, and it reached 100,000 people in 24 hours. And the comments and the chatter underneath that post is next level. You should definitely check it out, because you'll be able to relate to it with all the polling data that you have. So I'll end it off with one more question that I think that you both can definitely answer. I think a lot of folks are obviously worried. So I would like to know, what are the ramifications, if Donald Trump does not concede, hoping that Biden takes the ticket.
Seema, maybe I'll kick it over to you first.
So I'm gonna say something that I think Vice President Biden said pretty clearly in the debate the other night. We have a very strong democracy, and we have processes in place to protect our democracy. I think everybody needs to go out there and vote, and make sure that they are contributing to the strength of our democracy. I think there's certainly some folks engaging in some scenario planning if that's the case, but I think that what we can all do is make sure that we have the most vibrant democracy, because that is why so many of us came here, and why our parents actually came here, so proud to live in this vibrant democracy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I'm a political scientist by training. I started off in comparative politics and international relations, and what a moment to be in when we're talking about maybe like democracy under threat, authoritarianism. Never did we think that this would be the kinds of things we're talking about in the United States. I think it's so important to make sure that we're engaged, and to make sure that we're engaged beyond November, beyond January. What I would say is an important lesson from 2008 is that we cannot just rely on our elected officials to carry things through. We have to make sure that democratic engagement, small d included, remains robust throughout, no matter who is president, because the only people that are holding this up are the people, the citizens of this country. And I'm really hopeful that Indian Americans and South Asians more generally will remain active and engaged to hold their elected officials accountable, and to make sure that they carry through on all the things that they say that they're going to carry through on.
Absolutely, because it definitely is beyond identity, and we're looking forward to holding them accountable. So thank you. I really appreciate your insightful answers, and I'm grateful to be here. Thanks for the invite, Neil.
Of course. Thank you all so much for joining us. Trisha, I hope you're on the way to the early voting booth.
Sure.
We'll all stay in touch. Karthick, I'll keep looking out for your data. And Seema, very excited to see what you are doing post-election and your leadership nationally. So